Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I got an interesting question yesterday in the video comments that I thought I would cover. And it was kind of a two-part question. It was, what do I think about farmers' carries or farmers' walks for building traps? And if I don't think they're that great for it, why do strong men have such big traps? Let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing. Work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. This is actually going to be a very complex answer. It's going to be a very complex answer. Do I think farmers' walks stimulate some trap growth? Yes, I do. Do I think they're even remotely close to being responsible for most of the trapezius mass that you see in strongmen competitors? Nope. Do I think they're a particularly good trapezius exercise? No, not really. Do I think they're an amazing all-around exercise? Yes. I think farmers' walks are a fantastic form of GPP work and general physical preparedness. I think they're a good exercise for helping bring up some weak points. I think they're great for conditioning. I think they can help a little bit with traps. I think they're great grip builders. I think they're great core builders, right? It's a good exercise. They're a good exercise. It's an exercise that I advocate. But we kind of go back to the point of, if your goal was to build the most monstrous traps possible, would they be on my list of priorities for this? No. If your traps are a weak point for you that really needs extra work, farmers' walks really wouldn't be my go-to, although they wouldn't hurt as a form of conditioning for someone who has this problem. But the point we need to make here is to look at a couple different factors. We need to look at the data we have on the anatomy of muscles. We need to look at what we know stimulates muscle growth and all this other stuff. Now, this always gets brought up because people think about this whole stretch overloading thing. And the studies that get brought up, and I think I was the first person that I know of ever on YouTube to discuss these studies like 4 or 5 years ago, right? Years ago I was discussing this. But I said we can't extrapolate that completely to humans. And that's these bird studies where they took pigeons and they hung for days at a time more than the body weight of the pigeons off of one of their wings to see what would happen. And it caused an enormous amount of muscle growth. What was interesting is that it wasn't all hypertrophy. It was hyperplasia. We have never replicated ever a human study in which we have induced hyperplasia in humans with resistance training, at least that I am aware of. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not aware of any. Furthermore, when you take something that extreme, you can't extrapolate it down, meaning you're never going to get a human study that would replicate what was done to those birds. Okay, it would not get through the ethics review board, and I'm sure there are going to be some animal rights advocates and vegans who hear about these studies who are probably going to be screaming that maybe they shouldn't have been done to animals either. But that's really besides the point, because they were already done. No one's talking about doing them again. These studies are already in the past. The data is there. I'm not going to touch that one. But those studies were done. You are not, in any first world country, going to get a human trial through the ethics review board that would do this. It is not going to happen because it would be excruciatingly painful. It would be a form of torture. All right, what was done in those studies of those animals would qualify as torture. You're not going to do that to a person. It's just not going to be legal. There's no way it would get through an ethics review board. Because you're talking about taking a human and hanging 400 or 500 pounds off of one of their arms for 72 hours straight with no relief. All right, hanging that much weight from their limb. All right, the pain would be excruciating. Well, that's the level of stretch overload that was required for this to happen. It wasn't a 60-second farmer's walk with 300, 400 pounds in your hands spread over both hands. It was multiple times the body weight of the animal hanging off one limb, or days at a time. So you need to remember that. When we've looked at human trials on weighted stretches, they do stimulate some muscle growth, right? Stretch overload stimulates, at least in the ranges that people can tolerate, right? Well, you can hold on to for 60 seconds before you can't stand it anymore. That's what you can tolerate when you have the ability to turn loose. It stimulates some muscle growth, but it is a lot less muscle growth than we stimulate by actually training the muscle, right? It's a lot less. And adding more weight may not stimulate anymore, because at a certain point, a joint is only going to pull and stretch as far as the muscle is going to stretch. It's only going to stretch so far, and adding another 50 pounds isn't necessarily going to stretch it harder. You're going to have joints and ligaments and physical things that stop it. So there's even weight constraints as far as, unless you were talking about some extreme case to where it actually stretched the connective tissue and all of that, which is what happened in those animal studies. It was done for long periods of time. You've got to look at it from that perspective. It stimulates a little muscle growth, but a shrug will stimulate a lot more muscle growth than a stretch will. It's the same thing I point out with these rack pulls. We don't have good evidence that this stimulates much growth. Now, what I will say in regard to that is, if you're below your minimum effective volume, see that push it beyond it? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. If you're not training your traps quite hard enough, the additional overload of something like that might give it enough additional fatigue to go ahead and see some muscle growth. But you could probably add in one more set of exercises that train the traps directly through a full range of motion and get the same thing. It means if you see any trapezius growth by adding a stretch in, like anything from a rack pull to a farmer's walk, if it actually makes a noticeable difference over time, that meant you just weren't training your traps with enough workload. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that that exercise was the magic ticket. It meant you just weren't training that muscle enough to see the muscle growth that you wanted. That's all it means. And you've got to put that in perspective. Now, as far as exercises that hit the traps, we get a good idea what's going on there from even EMG data. We've got studies that measure the growth, but if you want to see muscle activation, Brent Contreras did a bunch of stuff. Got published all in TMAG. He did studies on different exercises and EMG. And EMG isn't the be-all, end-all. It's not perfect. It is not perfect data. It's ballpark. It's a ballpark. What did he find? Well, the ones where he looked at upper traps, stuff was compared of all these chin-ups and side laterals and different forms of overhead pressing, shrugs, everything else. Guess what the number one stimulator was for the upper traps? Shrugs. They produce the most activity, and it makes sense. You're moving the muscle through a full range of motion with a heavy weight. Heavy shrugs, like when they got up to like 315 on the shrugs, gave the best muscle activation. You know it was fairly close behind it? Standing barbell press. Standing barbell press. Produce something in the range of about 85%, if I remember correctly, around 85% of the stimulation, the activity that the shrugs did. So overhead pressing actually is a pretty good upper trap exercise. Pull-ups and laterals and all this other stuff, it all lagged behind. Those were considerably better than most of those for the upper trap. Now when we go look at mid trap, he didn't do a comparison of those, but he had mid and lower trap. It compared a bunch of different exercises. Believe it or not, like chin-ups didn't do that well. You know what did well? Barbell rows. Any form of heavy row worked the mid and lower traps. In fact, deadlifts did decent, or at least he did rack pulls. They did decent. They didn't do anywhere near as well as rows did. Rowing built the mid traps the best. Rowing built the mid traps. So we could argue that if you wanted to really build your traps up, any sort of pulling, rows, shrugs, standing barbell presses, hang cleans, power cleans, right? That should build your traps up pretty good. Deadlifts help, but surprisingly enough, even though deadlifts are an amazing exercise, deadlifts actually did more for lats than they did for traps on his EMG data. I'm not saying that's going to be universally applicable if we were to test it in different spots, but that's kind of what was noted there. Deadlifts are a great exercise. I love deadlifts. I think everyone should deadlift. But even deadlifts, due to, I guess the stretch nature involved, is only a stretch overload. It's only a stretch overload for the traps. It just didn't work as well as rows did. And there's no way it's going to work as well as a shrug or an overhead press. So when someone asked me about strongman competitors, do I think the farmers walks are the reason they have big traps? You're talking about guys who do heavy deadlifts, guys who do a lot of heavy overhead pressing. Overhead pressing is part of competition. That's a primary exercise for strongman competitors. They do enormous amounts of overhead pressing. All strongman competitors are extremely strong at overhead pressing. Is it any surprise they have big traps? They also do a lot of deadlifting, a lot of pulling. A lot of them do a lot of cleaning. Actually, cleaning is part of what they do too. Do you think that's why they have big traps? I'm sure the farmer's walks probably help a little bit, but those other exercises are most of it. And most of them are on a lot of drugs. They're on a lot of drugs. You want to know what will grow traps really, 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 really fast? Any form of androgenic drug. Because of the number of androgen receptors in your traps and shoulders, there's more receptors in those muscles than a lot of the other muscles in the body. Those muscles respond more to people who use basically anabolics. They respond more. So you have guys who do enormous amounts of pulling, enormous amounts of cleaning and overhead pressing, who use huge amounts of androgens. That's why they have big traps. And the fact that most of them are also, 300 plus pounds, depending upon, what degree of competition you're in. So there's your answer there. So the truth is, if you really and truly wanted big traps, let's say shrugs, overhead pressing, rowing, cleaning, that's how you're going to build traps. That's how you're going to build traps. That's the most efficient and effective way to do so. I'm not saying farmer's walks are a bad exercise, because farmer's walks are fantastic. It's not the fastest way to build traps. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.